Last episode, we talked about how liberalism had changed, had evolved into more radical factions, with the left now consisting of socialists and many other notions that are coming about in a lot of the different nations of Europe. So the right became far right or conservative, and the center right was basically middle class, who actually adopted and implemented some of those liberal, laissez-faire economic policies as they assumed power in their governments. Now, again, if you remember, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So the first cold that we're going to talk about here, the first nation to follow France's lead in revolutionizing or revolutionary tactics in 1830 was Belgium. Remember, we talked about this earlier. This kingdom was created as a buffer zone to check future French aggression. When they made the Kingdom of the Netherlands, they disregarded nationalistic forces. Its union with Holland after the Congress of Vienna had proved unsuccessful. All right, there were a lot of wide cultural and nationalistic differences between the Netherlands and Belgium. And in fact, King William I of Orange openly declared the official language of the Kingdom of the Netherlands Dutch. Well, again, that probably makes sense to you because it's the Netherlands. But remember, when you have Belgium within that kingdom, there's a lot of German-speaking people that are like, why do we have to use Dutch as our national language? So he also made the Dutch provinces, which had only 2 million people, equal in representation to Belgium's representation in the Parliamentary Estates General, who had 3.5 million. So, again, if you're German or you're Belgian, you're thinking, wait a second, we have more people, but yet we have equal representation with those people from the Netherlands. So basically, additionally, some other things that caused some dissatisfaction among the Belgians was that King William refused special status of the Catholic Church in Belgium and offended them by making education of priests subject to state supervision. So he was messing with their religion as well. So they revolted August 25th, 1830, copying the French. Belgium chose as their king the son of Louis Philippe. All right, thinking that, okay, that's going to help. Some of the other conservative nations, even France, are going to be okay with this revolt. But the fact is, England got annoyed. They thought that Louis was trying to create a satellite of France near England. So again, very suspicious of this move. Why would they offer it to Louis Philippe's son? But anyway, so they convinced actually the Belgians not to undo their revolt. They said, go ahead and continue with their revolt, but we want you to name Leopold I of Germany, who was actually the son-in-law of King George IV. If you remember, the Hanover, the House of Hanover, came from Sophia of Hanover, and Hanover was initially Germany. So if you guys remember when the whole Stuart saga, the Glorious Revolution, after that fact, the Act of Settlement, to make sure that there was no more civil war in England, they gave actually the crown to a German family. So that's where we get all the Georges. And again, we talked about that earlier, so if you remember that, great. If you don't, that's where we're talking about this link with England and Germany. So thus the closeness, I should say, and alliance with England that Belgium had as led to England getting involved in war with the Germans in the future in 1914 with World War I. When the Germans invaded France, they went through Belgium, and that's what prompted England to get involved. And we'll talk about that here in about a week. So anyway, in November of 1830, a national congress declared Belgium's independence, and they adopted a liberal constitution. So this is significant because not only did they copy France's lead, it marked the first permanent break from the Vienna settlement of the Congress of Vienna, the concert of Europe. It was the most successful nationalistic European revolution in 1830. William did try to reconquer, but the British and French said, no, we don't think so. You're not going to do that. So Belgians gained independence. Additionally, I apologize, I'm messing up my slide here. Additionally, in 1815, the Russians granted a constitution to Poland that established a limited degree of Polish autonomy, although, as we've indicated, most of that power was still in the hands of Russia. They had to answer to Alexander. But in 1830, there's that year again, revolt broke out in Warsaw and spread to the countryside. The Russians, under Nicholas's orders, sent in troops to suppress and crush the revolt. In fact, the Polish, initially they did well, but if I remember, they had an outbreak of sickness, and a lot of the officers couldn't lead in battle, and so it was suppressed, the revolt was suppressed and crushed. In February of 1832, Nicholas issued something called the Organic Statute, which suspended the Polish constitution and declared Poland an official part of the Russian Empire. So make sure you know that Organic Statute, it's part of them. And then the Russians also began a policy of Russification in Poland. You need to know that term, Russification. It's a form of cultural assimilation during which non-Russian communities, voluntarily or not, give up their culture and language in favor of the Russian language. Additionally, 1830 brought out more reform. Now, again, there wasn't a full-out revolt, but the Tory reform that began in the 1820s under the Lord Liverpool's watch, it kind of started the reform, but he didn't necessarily orchestrate it. There were young Tory members that actually began to push for moderate reforms. Their names were George Canning and Robert Peel. From 1820 to 1827, Robert Peel served as Home Secretary and won parliamentary approval for reform in criminal codes and substantially reducing the number of capital crimes. Peel also organized, and you read this in chapter 21, the London Police. And in honor of him, they became known as the Bobbies. Now, religious restrictions were also removed. In 1829, Parliament repealed the Test Act from 1673, if you remember that whole Parliament saga with the Stuarts and the English Civil War, the Anglicans versus the Catholics and all those other things. The Test Act had actually barred nonconformists or non-Anglicans from public office. So in 1829, they also passed the Catholic Emancipation Act, giving Catholics the right to vote and hold office. Additionally, the Tories started to move England gradually away from mercantilism and towards free trade liberal policies by reducing tariffs. So it's interesting. Again, we see the Tories actually morphing here. And, remember, the Whigs were more reform-minded, but it's actually the Tories that are actually implementing a lot of these reforms. Okay? So, again, we get into, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Early in the 19th century, British Parliament was far from democratic, as we've talked about, and not a very good representation of the population. The House of Lords represented the hereditary nobility and the bishops in the Church of England. Additionally, the king sometimes exercised his right to create new peers or noblemen who were given the right to sit in the House of Lords or the House of Commons. So the House of Lords could basically block the adoption of any law or any proposed legislation from the House of Commons, which was more representative of not the common people, but anything that they were basically an alternative to the aristocracy. So the House of Commons, as I said, represented mainly the prosperous gentlemen of the country, or what we call the gentry, and the wealthy businessmen who emerged as a result of the industrialization of England. All right, so only a small population of adult males actually met the requirements and could actually vote, and many members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords were actually, in cahoots. So really, additionally, in terms of the House of Commons, many of the members represented what were called rotten boroughs. They were towns with very small populations whose voters could readily be bribed or otherwise influenced. That's why they called them rotten boroughs. Or they were also sometimes called pocket boroughs. Two different terms here, but the pocket boroughs were towns whose representatives in the House of Commons were selected by the nobility, noble landowners, old school. So again, House of Commons, even though on the surface it looks like, oh yeah, they represent all of the common people, the fact of the matter was they didn't. And what we talked about in chapter 20, these new industrial towns that popped up like Manchester were actually driving the wealth and the population of England, and they were completely without representation or seriously underrepresented. And the irony of this is they had the most people. So, a lot of people started saying, something's got to give. We got to get some reform going here. And that's what we mentioned. You have the Whigs. We talked about some Tory reform. Well, let's talk about the Whigs here. The Whigs supported many different reforms. From 1828 to 1830, the Duke of Wellington actually served as Prime Minister. While he was the guy that orchestrated the victory at Waterloo and was a great national hero, he was a reactionary Tory and had no intention of reforming any further. So in 1830, however, the Tories lost the general election to the Whig Party. And in 1831, the new Whig leader and Prime Minister, Earl Grey, won approval of the House of Commons for a parliamentary reform bill. But the thing was that the conservatives, as well as some of the reactionary liberals in the House of Lords, rejected it. So the House of Commons passed a second reform bill the same year, and the Lords once again rejected it. So Grey appealed to the new king, King George IV, who promised at his coronation to create enough Whig peers to assure a Lord's passage of a reform bill. So they actually involved the king here. And so, you know, what ends up happening here is the threat worked. In 1832, the House of Lords approved the third reform bill, the third reform measure of the House of Commons. And it basically deprived 56 rotten and pocket boroughs of their 111 seats in the House of Commons, while 32 other small boroughs lost one of their two equal members. Now, the 143 available seats were distributed to the boroughs that had been underrepresented without any representation at all, like I said, Manchester and some of those industrial towns. So basically, don't worry about all the numbers here. Just notice that they reformed, and now it's a fairer depiction of the population of England. So some of those heavily populated areas now are being represented. So it's more of a true democratic approach. So it's liberal in that aspect. In addition, they extended in the Reform Bill of 1832 the rights to vote to middle-class men. The property qualifications continued to bar most workers from voting, but again, nevertheless, this is a step in the right direction in terms of liberalism. Nevertheless, the Reform Bill represented the beginning of a decisive shift in political power from the landed aristocracy to the middle class. Right, Colin?
Yeah.
Attaboy. So other reforms ensue here, okay? Again, this is the 1830s. That's what we're still talking about. We've talked about revolts in Belgium. We talked about revolts in England, a failed revolt in Poland. But in England, we have more of, you know, kind of a legislative revolt. And the other reforms that continued with redistricting of the English politics was a Factory Act that was adopted in 1833. Talked a little bit about this in chapter 20. Children under the age of 9 could not be employed in the textile mills, while those between the ages of 9 and 13 could not work for more than 9 hours a day. Work by kids 13 to 18, age 13 to 18, was limited to 12 hours a day, and it also created a new system of inspectors to make sure that the law was actually being observed. Slavery, you need to know this, was abolished in 1833. Parliament got rid of it in their entire empire, and it was brought about by the abolitionist work of a guy named William Wilberforce, which, if you want extra credit, there's a really good movie out there called Amazing Grace, which goes through how slavery was sold and how slavery, I should say, the abolition movement was sold to Parliament. There were also the Poor Laws in 1834, which required healthy, unemployed workers to live in poorhouses and attempt to clean up the cities. This was middle-class driven, obviously not poor. We talked about how those were basically like prisons. And then in 1838, there was a failed People's Charter that we mentioned in the last chapter as well. And even though it failed, the universal suffrage didn't happen. It did impact the newly realigned Parliament to make further reforms. And the following are examples of this reform-minded spirit. The Mines Act in 1834 and 42 limited, then banned further child labor in the mines, and then the 10-Hour Act in 1847 limited work hours for women and children to, as you can figure out, 10 hours per day. Okay? So again, the Chartists, even though they failed, they helped, even though they sought bringing about universal male suffrage. They didn't get what they wanted, but even though it failed, all the ideas that were adopted in the late 19th century and by the 20th century, they did get all of their demands. So in 1837, King William IV died, and he was succeeded by then 18-year-old Victoria, whose reign became the longest in English history, and this begins the Victorian era, and a lot of reforms are associated with the Victorian era. Additionally, the quest to repeal the Corn Laws was a powerful evidence of this increased political power of the British middle class, and the Anti-Corn Law League, which was established in 1839, campaigned for the repeal of the Corn Laws, which, if you've forgotten, were the tariffs on wheat and other grains enacted at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but continued to benefit the landed aristocracy and the gentry farmers. So even though the war was over, it helped that class out, and so they kept, when they had power in Parliament, they kept those tariffs high. The Anti-Corn Law League wanted to free up trade and lower the tariffs. The Anti-Corn Law League included industrialists like Richard Cobden and John Bright. They argued that lowering the price of food would improve the workers' conditions and the standard of living while reducing the cost of raw materials And if you reduce the cost of raw materials, that would make it easier for the industrialists to pay their workers lower wages to compete. Now, again, I know that sounds weird, but the fact that they could pay their workers less, it wouldn't be as drastic because the